Dust clouds billowed behind the convoy of Sherman tanks and armored vehicles as they rolled through the German countryside in April 1945. The 6th Armored Division, known as the Super 6th, had been advancing rapidly through Saxony, pushing deeper into the crumbling Reich. Among the soldiers was Sergeant James Mitchell, a battle-hardened veteran whose weathered face bore the marks of 3 years of European combat. The war was nearly over. Everyone could feel it. Hitler's forces were collapsing on all fronts, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating in disarray. But for Mitchell and his men, each mile forward revealed new horrors that would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. The countryside bore the scars of total war: burned villages, abandoned equipment, and the constant reminder that this conflict had consumed everything in its path. Mitchell had joined the 6th Armored Division in England in 1944, training for the invasion of Europe. He had landed at Normandy just weeks after D-Day, fighting through the hedgerows of France, the forests of Belgium, and now the heartland of Nazi Germany. Each battle had hardened him, but nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead in the final weeks of the European war. As they approached the outskirts of Penig, a small industrial town nestled along the Mulde River, the landscape began to change. The pastoral German countryside gave way to something more sinister. Barbed wire glinted in the afternoon sun, and the acrid smell of smoke and human misery drifted on the wind. The very air seemed heavy with suffering, a tangible presence that made the soldiers instinctively check their weapons and scan the horizon for threats. Mitchell raised his hand, signaling the convoy to halt. Through his binoculars, he could see the outline of what appeared to be a prison camp. Wooden barracks stretched across a muddy compound surrounded by electrified fencing and guard towers. But something was wrong. The towers appeared abandoned, and the main gate hung open, swaying in the breeze like a broken promise. The soldiers dismounted cautiously, weapons ready. They had liberated other camps before, but each one brought fresh shock and revulsion. As they approached the entrance, Mitchell noticed scattered papers blowing across the ground and the remnants of hastily abandoned guard posts. The Germans had fled, but they had left something behind that would test every principle these American soldiers held dear. Beyond the gate lay a scene that would be burned into Mitchell's memory forever. Dozens of women, their skeletal frames barely covered by tattered prison uniforms, huddled together in the muddy courtyard. Their eyes, sunken deep into gaunt faces, reflected a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Some attempted to stand as the American soldiers approached, their legs trembling under the effort, while others remained motionless on the ground, too weak to move. The sight was overwhelming in its horror. These women had been reduced to living skeletons, their humanity stripped away by months or years of systematic abuse. Their hair had fallen out in patches, their skin hung loose over protruding bones, and many bore the marks of beatings and worse. Some clutched small possessions, a photograph, a piece of bread, a scrap of cloth, as if these tiny remnants of their former lives were all that kept them tethered to hope. Mitchell felt his stomach clench. He had seen the aftermath of battles, the carnage of war, but nothing had prepared him for this systematic dehumanization. These women were barely alive, their bodies ravaged by months or years of starvation, disease, and abuse. The smell of death and disease hung over the compound like a shroud, and Mitchell had to fight back the urge to vomit. He turned to his radio man, his voice steady despite the horror before him. "Get the medics up here immediately, and contact headquarters. Tell them we've found another camp. These people need immediate medical attention. Tell them we need food, medical supplies, and transportation. And get me the chaplain." The soldiers sprang into action with the efficiency born of experience. Medics rushed forward with their aid bags, while others secured the perimeter and began searching the abandoned buildings. The women watched with a mixture of fear and amazement as American soldiers knelt beside them, offering water and rations with gentle words of reassurance. Private Rodriguez, a young medic from San Antonio, knelt beside an elderly woman who appeared to be unconscious. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. "Ma'am," he said softly in broken German, "you're safe now. We're Americans. We're here to help." The woman's eyes fluttered open and she stared at him with confusion and disbelief. Dr. Sarah Coleman, one of the few female medical officers attached to the division, moved among the survivors with practiced efficiency. Her trained eye quickly assessed the situation. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and various stages of disease. she reported to Mitchell. Many of these women were Hungarian, she realized, likely political prisoners or those caught up in the Nazi deportation programs that had swept through Eastern Europe. The medical situation was dire. Many of the women were suffering from typhus, dysentery, and other diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the camp. Some had infected wounds that had gone untreated for weeks. Dr. Coleman worked methodically, triaging the most critical cases while her team set up a makeshift field hospital in one of the abandoned buildings. As the medics worked, Mitchell and his team began exploring the camp's administrative buildings. They discovered hastily abandoned offices, scattered documents, and evidence of the systematic brutality that had occurred here. Filing cabinets had been overturned, papers burned in metal drums, and safes left open and empty. The Germans had tried to destroy the evidence, but enough remained to paint a picture of calculated cruelty. In one office, Mitchell found a ledger that recorded the daily rations provided to prisoners: a thin soup made from potato peels, a small piece of black bread, and occasionally a bit of ersatz coffee. The calories provided were barely enough to sustain life, and certainly not enough for the hard labor the women were forced to perform in nearby munitions factories. In one building, they found a small group of German guards who had either been too slow to escape or had chosen to surrender. They huddled together, their faces pale with fear, knowing that their crimes would soon be exposed. Some still wore their SS uniforms, while others had tried to disguise themselves in civilian clothes. One guard, a nervous man in his 40s named Klaus Weber, was brought before Mitchell. The sergeant's steel-gray eyes bore into him with barely controlled anger. Weber had been a supervisor at the camp, responsible for overseeing the work details and maintaining discipline among the prisoners. "What happened here?" Mitchell demanded in his broken German, his voice cold as winter steel. The guard stammered, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape route. "We were following orders," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The prisoners were workers laboring for the war effort. When it became clear that the Americans were approaching, we were told to evacuate, to leave no evidence behind. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He had heard similar justifications at other liberated camps, but they did nothing to diminish his rage. "These women are human beings, not evidence," he said coldly. "Your orders led to their suffering and death. You will answer for what you've done here." Weber began to protest, claiming that he had only been following orders, that he had no choice in the matter. But Mitchell cut him off with a gesture. The sergeant had no patience for excuses, no sympathy for those who had participated in this systematic brutality. He ordered the guards to be secured and held for questioning by intelligence officers. The guard lowered his head, unable to meet Mitchell's penetrating stare. The sergeant turned away in disgust, his attention returning to the immediate needs of the survivors. There would be time for justice later. Now, the priority was saving lives and restoring dignity to those who had suffered so much. As evening approached, more American units arrived to assist with the liberation. Medical personnel set up a field hospital, while engineers worked to restore basic sanitation and shelter. The women, though still desperately weak, began to show signs of life returning to their eyes as they realized their ordeal was truly over. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Women who had been too frightened to speak began whispering to each other in Hungarian. Some managed weak smiles when offered food or medical care. Others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their circumstances. For many, it was the first kindness they had experienced in months or years. Mitchell knelt beside one of the younger survivors, a woman who appeared to be in her early 20s despite her emaciated condition. Her dark hair was matted and filthy, but her eyes held an intelligence that suffering had not been able to extinguish. She wore the remnants of what had once been a teacher's dress, now torn and stained beyond recognition. "You're safe now," he said gently in English, hoping she might understand. "We're here to help. No one will hurt you anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered in accented English, "Thank you. Thank you for coming. I thought no one would ever come." Mitchell felt a lump form in his throat. He had been trained as a soldier, to fight and to kill when necessary. But in that moment he understood that his duty extended far beyond the battlefield. It was about protecting human dignity and preserving hope in the darkest of times. This young woman, despite everything she had endured, still had hope. That hope was now his responsibility to protect. The next morning brought new challenges. Word had spread through the local German population that the Americans had liberated the camp, and some of the former guards and camp administrators began attempting to return, claiming they needed to retrieve personal belongings or official documents. Mitchell immediately recognized the danger this posed to the vulnerable survivors. The local German civilians were a mix of the genuinely ignorant and the willfully blind. Some claimed they had no knowledge of what had happened at the camp, despite its proximity to their town. Others admitted they had heard rumors but insisted they were powerless to intervene. A few, to their credit, offered to help with food and supplies for the survivors. When 3 former guards approached the camp entrance, demanding access to the administrative buildings, Mitchell positioned himself directly in their path. His men flanked him, weapons at the ready, but it was the sergeant's unwavering presence that sent the clearest message. These men had participated in unspeakable cruelty, and they would not be allowed to intimidate or threaten the survivors. "You have no business here," Mitchell stated firmly. "This facility is now under American military control. Any attempt to enter without authorization will be considered an act of aggression." One of the Germans, apparently a former camp administrator named Heinrich Müller, protested that they had legal rights to certain documents and personal property. He was a thin man with nervous eyes, who had clearly held a position of authority in the camp's hierarchy. He gestured toward the women survivors, suggesting they were unreliable witnesses who might make false accusations against innocent German officials. Muller's arrogance was breathtaking. Even faced with the evidence of his crimes, he continued to assert his rights and question the credibility of his victims. He spoke of legal procedures and proper documentation, as if the systematic starvation and abuse of innocent women could be justified by paperwork. It was then that Mitchell spoke the words that would define his actions and those of countless other American liberators. "They belong to me now." His voice carried absolute authority and unshakable resolve. "These women are under the protection of the United States Army, and I will personally ensure that no harm comes to them." The phrase was not one of possession, but of responsibility. Mitchell was declaring that these survivors were now his sacred trust, that their safety and dignity were his personal mission. He was drawing a line in the sand, making it clear that anyone who threatened these women would have to go through him first. The German civilians understood the message clearly and retreated without further argument. Muller's face flushed with anger, but he knew better than to challenge an armed American sergeant who had just claimed protective custody over the camp survivors. The other Germans muttered among themselves but followed Muller's lead in withdrawing from the area. Dr. Coleman, who had witnessed the confrontation, approached Mitchell afterward. "That was exactly what they needed to hear," she said. "Many of these women have been terrorized for so long that they can't believe they're truly safe. Your words gave them something they haven't had in years: the promise of protection." The doctor had been working around the clock to provide medical care to the survivors. She had seen the physical evidence of their abuse: malnutrition so severe that some women weighed less than 80 pounds, infected wounds that had gone untreated for weeks, and psychological trauma that would take years to heal. But she had also seen their resilience, their determination to survive despite everything they had endured. Over the following days, the full scope of the camp's horrors became clear. The survivors, as they regained some strength, began sharing their stories. They were Hungarian Jews, political prisoners, and resistance fighters who had been transported to Peenig to work in nearby munitions factories. The conditions had been deliberately brutal, designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal sustenance. The women told stories of 18-hour workdays in freezing factories, of being beaten for the slightest infraction, of watching friends and family members die from starvation and disease. They spoke of guards who took pleasure in their suffering, of administrators who treated them as less than human. But they also spoke of small acts of kindness between prisoners, of shared food and whispered prayers that had kept hope alive in the darkest moments. One survivor, Maria Kovac, had been a teacher in Budapest before her arrest. She spoke English well and became an informal translator between the American forces and the other Hungarian women. Through her, Mitchell learned of the systematic abuse, the arbitrary executions, and the deliberate starvation that had characterized daily life in the camp. Maria had been arrested for hiding Jewish students in her school. She had been betrayed by a colleague who sought favor with the Nazi authorities. Her crime was compassion. Her punishment was to be worked to death in a German labor camp. But she had survived, and now she used her language skills to help her fellow survivors communicate with their American liberators. The Americans documented everything meticulously. Photographers recorded the conditions, medical personnel documented the physical evidence of abuse, and intelligence officers collected testimonies that would later be used in war crimes trials. But beyond the official procedures, individual soldiers formed personal connections with the survivors. Private Tommy Rodriguez, a medic from Texas, spent hours teaching basic English phrases to some of the younger women. He showed them photographs of his family, his hometown, his life before the war. For women who had been told that Americans were monsters, these glimpses of normal family life were revelatory. Rodriguez's gentle manner and obvious compassion helped them begin to trust again. Corporal Frank O'Brien shared photographs of his family back in Chicago, showing the survivors that there was still goodness and normalcy in the world. He had a daughter about the same age as some of the younger prisoners, and he couldn't help but imagine what he would want someone to do for her if she were in their situation. These small acts of humanity were as important as the medical treatment in helping the women begin to heal. Meanwhile, similar scenes were playing out across liberated Europe. In the Philippines, American forces had recently liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where dozens of American military nurses had been held as prisoners of war since 1942. These women, known as the Angels of Bataan, had endured 3 years of captivity, starvation, and uncertainty. The Angels of Bataan were military nurses who had been serving in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They had remained at their posts, caring for wounded soldiers during the siege of Bataan and Corregidor. When those positions fell, they were captured and spent the remainder of the war in Japanese prison camps. When the 1st Cavalry Division liberated Santo Tomas in February 1945, the scene was remarkably similar to what Mitchell was witnessing in Germany. American soldiers found their own countrywomen reduced to skeletal frames, their uniforms hanging loose on emaciated bodies. The liberating forces immediately declared the same protective stance. These women were now under American protection, and their safety was paramount. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brady, who led the liberation of Santo Tomas, had used almost identical words to Mitchell's when confronted by Japanese guards attempting to maintain control over the prisoners. "These nurses belong to the United States Army," he had declared. "They are under our protection now." The parallel experiences highlighted a fundamental aspect of American military culture during World War II, the absolute commitment to protecting the vulnerable, whether they were American citizens or foreign nationals who had suffered under Axis brutality. This was not just military doctrine, it was a moral imperative that defined what America stood for in the war against fascism. Back in Penig, Mitchell found himself thinking about these broader implications as he watched the daily progress of the survivors. Each day brought small victories. A woman who could finally stand without assistance, another who smiled for the first time since liberation, a group who began singing a Hungarian folk song during their evening meal. The recovery process was slow but steady. The women's bodies began to respond to proper nutrition and medical care. Their spirits too began to heal as they realized they were truly safe. Some began to laugh again, to share memories of their lives before the war, to make plans for the future. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Dr. Coleman reported steady medical improvements across the group. With proper nutrition and medical care, the human body's capacity for recovery is remarkable, she told Mitchell. But the psychological healing will take much longer. Many of these women have lost everything: their families, their homes, their sense of security in the world. This reality weighed heavily on Mitchell and his men. They knew that liberation was only the first step in a long journey toward recovery. The women would eventually need to be repatriated to Hungary, but reports from Eastern Europe suggested that their homeland was now under Soviet control, with its own set of uncertainties and dangers. The geopolitical situation was complex and troubling. Hungary had been an Axis ally, but many of its citizens had been victims of Nazi persecution. Now, with the Red Army occupying the country, there were concerns about how returning prisoners would be treated. Some might be viewed with suspicion for having survived German captivity, while others might face persecution for their political beliefs or ethnic background. As the weeks passed, Mitchell developed a particular concern for the younger survivors, especially those who had no family left to return to. Maria Kovacs, the former teacher, had become something of a leader among the women, helping to organize their daily routines and serving as a liaison with the American forces. Maria had lost her entire family in the Holocaust. Her parents, her siblings, her fiancé, all had perished in the camps or been killed during deportations. She had only her own strength and intelligence to rely on, and she used both to help her fellow survivors navigate this new reality of freedom. One evening, as Mitchell made his regular rounds through the temporary barracks the engineers had constructed, Maria approached him with a request that would test his commitment to his protective promise. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said in her careful English, "some of the women are afraid of what will happen when we must leave here. We have heard that Hungary is now controlled by the Soviets, and we fear we may face new persecution for having been in a German camp." Mitchell listened carefully, understanding the complexity of her concern. The geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe was indeed uncertain, and there were legitimate fears about how returning prisoners might be treated by new communist governments. Some might be accused of collaboration, others might face persecution for their political or religious beliefs. "I made you a promise," Mitchell replied. "I said you belong to me now, and that means I'm responsible for your safety until you're truly free. We'll work with the Red Cross and other agencies to ensure you have choices about where you go and what you do next." This conversation led Mitchell to begin advocating within his chain of command for special consideration for the POW survivors. He wrote detailed reports recommending that the women be given options for resettlement in Western countries if they feared persecution in Soviet-controlled Hungary. His reports were thorough and passionate, documenting not only the women's suffering, but also their courage and resilience. His efforts were part of a larger American commitment to displaced persons that would continue long after the war's end. The United States would eventually accept hundreds of thousands of European refugees, many of them concentration camp survivors who could not safely return to their homelands. This commitment reflected American values of compassion and human dignity that had been reinforced by the liberation experience. The liberation of POW also contributed to the growing body of evidence that would be used in the Nuremberg trials and other war crimes proceedings. The testimonies collected by Mitchell and his team, along with the physical evidence and photographs, helped establish the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities. Justice would be served, but it would take time and careful documentation. But perhaps more importantly, the actions of Mitchell and countless other American soldiers established a moral precedent that would influence American foreign policy for decades to come. The idea that the United States had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable and defend human dignity became a cornerstone of America's post-war identity. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the women of POW continued their recovery under American protection. Some chose to return to Hungary despite the risks, hoping to find surviving family members. Others accepted offers of resettlement in Western countries. A few, including Maria Kovacs, eventually immigrated to the United States, where they would spend the rest of their lives as grateful American citizens. For Sergeant James Mitchell, the experience at POW became a defining moment that shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve his country. Years later, when asked about his declaration that the women belonged to him, he would explain that it represented the highest calling of military service, the protection of human dignity in the face of evil. The phrase, "they belong to me," now became more than just words spoken in a moment of crisis. It became a symbol of American commitment to justice and human rights, a promise that would echo through subsequent conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world. It represented the best of American values, the willingness to stand up for the innocent and protect those who cannot protect themselves. If you found this story of courage and compassion moving, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up. Your like helps us share these important historical stories with more people who need to hear them. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you know of similar stories of protection and humanity during wartime? Have you or your family been touched by acts of courage like Sergeant Mitchell's? Share your reflections with our community. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're dedicated to bringing you powerful, historically accurate stories that honor the brave men and women who stood up for what's right in humanity's darkest hours. Your subscription helps us continue researching and sharing these vital pieces of history that must never be forgotten. Together, we can ensure that stories of courage, compassion, and human dignity continue to inspire future generations. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.